Imagine this. You've had to abandon your ship, loaded heavily with aviation fuel, after it was set on fire in an attack. You and your comrades took to the ocean in 2 lifeboats, but in the chop and the darkness, you've been separated. Now your boat drifts aimlessly, and a full day later, as a storm is just beginning to blow, a light is spotted off on the horizon. You pull with all your might on the oars, and you even rig a sail, hoping for rescue, and you find, to your absolute surprise, that the light is actually a ship on fire. It's the ship you abandoned yesterday, but it's still afloat, and it hasn't sunk yet. This is the exact bizarre scenario that the crew of the MV San Demetrio found themselves in late 1940. Caught out in an assault by a German pocket battleship, the vessel had an epic comeback after its men abandoned it to burn and presumably explode, only to come across the thing still burning happily the next day. What happened next is one of the great feats of maritime daring-do from the war. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the incredible true tale of the San Demetrio, the ship that rescued its own crew. Late 1940. The war has been raging for a full year now, since Nazi Germany's Panzer IIs and IIIs rolled over the Polish border. After the phony war had come the invasion of France and Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway. Britain was on the ropes. But the Battle of Britain had shown that Germany's forces could be defeated. The island nation held out under intense nighttime raids by the Luftwaffe, while at sea, the Kriegsmarine's U-boats and warships hunted with near impunity. The strategy had been to starve Britain into submission, to deprive it of the critical materials it needed from friendly powers across the sea to keep the war machine humming. Merchant ships bunched up in convoys for protection, but the protection the Royal Navy could actually offer was often pathetic. Their most powerful ships were tied up in the Mediterranean, and even a destroyer could hardly be detached from fleet work to do something as mundane as escort duty. So merchant ships were given little 3 and 4 inch guns, or QF 12 pounders, and told, essentially, to hope for the best. Now, one of these convoys was HX84. It had steamed from Halifax, bound for Liverpool, on October 28th, 1940. Made up of 38 ships, oil tankers and freighters, the convoy had originally been protected by the ancient Wicks-class destroyer Columbia and the Clemson-class St. Francis, which were both built in the last war. But alongside those ships was Jervis Bay, an ocean liner converted through the addition of guns no bigger than 6 inches and dating to the late 1800s into an armed merchant cruiser. Now, recent history had shown that ocean liners make for shocking auxiliary cruisers, but the Royal Navy was tied up, and the Admiralty was in a desperate position, so Jervis Bay and many like her were called up to pull off a task that could suddenly often turn brutal. So HX84 set off with Columbia and St. Francis both peeling off after a day of escort duty clearing the coast. The convoy plodded on until November 5th, when they were about 800 miles or 1,300 kilometers southeast of the tip of Greenland. In mid-Atlantic, a smudge of smoke was spotted on the horizon. Now, we've covered this story before in some detail, but you can only imagine the convoy's collective horror when the smudge materialized into the massive heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, the kind of fast miniature battleship that was ideally suited for hunting down and killing convoys. With its fast-acting 11-inch main guns at a top speed of 28 knots, there was simply no running. With a main belt of 80mm or 3 inches of steel armor, there wasn't a single gun between any of the ships on the convoy that could possibly hurt her. But still, the escort, Jervis Bay, peeled off to draw Admiral Scheer's fire in a kind of desperate self-sacrifice that many have since described as reckless, but which, in my opinion at least, served to tie the German warship down long enough for the convoy to scatter and try to escape into the dusk. Now, Jervis Bay was hit and basically taken to bits by the German gunfire, and the Scheer turned its attention to the panicked and fleeing convoy ships. One of them was a tanker absolutely loaded with aviation fuel. Now, there are certain cargoes you just don't want to be carrying if you're hit, and right at the top of that list would have to be gasoline and fuel. The tanker was a floating keg. The San Demetrio was a modern kind of tanker built back in 1938, with 8-cylinder diesels and a hull that was about 463 feet or 141 meters long, and about 8,073 gross registered tons. She wasn't a giant ship, but she was a modern and utilitarian workhorse that had been built for the Eagle Oil and Shipping Company in peacetime, but now found itself in one of the most dangerous and unforgiving battlefields in the world. On her bridge was Captain George Waite, who'd already experienced hell at sea because in late 1939 he'd been the skipper of the tanker San Alberto that was caught and torpedoed by the U-48. He now watched on appalled as Admiral Scheer sped straight past the now silent and burning Jervis Bay and turned her guns on the convoy. It was every man for himself. The New Zealand liner Ranjitiki was hit, but she dropped a dense smoke screen that hit her well enough to make an escape. Others weren't so fortunate. German shells slammed into them, and Waite, on the San Demetrio, had to try to steer his vessel to safety. With the light failing, he hoped he might escape into the night, and he altered course to starboard to clear the main body of fleeing merchant ships. But there was a shout of alarm from a lookout because a ship to their right, off on the starboard bow, was attempting to do the opposite and seemingly steer directly into them. Fortunately, collision was just avoided. Then Waite and his men felt San Demetrio tremble underfoot because she was hit. Night had fallen, but a big moon was illuminating the horizon ahead of the German cruiser, which could easily pick its prey out of the darkness. It fired on, and the crew of the San Demetrio only being able to see flashes in the dark from far behind them. Shells rained down all around. The ship they'd narrowly avoided colliding with was hit first, and the screams of the wounded drifted across the water. Then it was San Demetrio's turn. Hit after hit, shell after shell struck home, and soon the vessel was burning fiercely. After only 1 hour since the Admiral Scheer had started the attack, San Demetrio was presumed a total loss. Burning completely out of control, she'd become a giant petrol bomb just waiting to go off at any moment. Now, this wasn't diesel fuel. It was fast-burning, high-octane aviation gas that threatened to detonate into an all-consuming, enormous fireball. Captain Waite knew the game was up, and he wasted absolutely no time at all. He ordered his ship hastily abandoned. A handful of boats were swung out and lowered, but one was swamped, leaving just the forward, starboard, and port boats bobbing together in the darkening night, one loaded with 26 men and the other with just 16. Now, briefly tethered together, a plan was formed to get away from the tanker as quickly as possible, but now they had another issue. Ships from the convoy were tearing past them from every angle in a desperate bid for escape. They were badly at risk of being run down by one of their own ships. The men rowed like demons to get out of the way, but when the danger had cleared and the night became still, the two boats had been separated and set out into the night. Most alarmingly of all, the wind was freshening, and it looked like there might be a storm on the horizon. Admiral Scheer hunted and fired on vessels well into the night, until she finally disengaged about midnight. 5 merchant ships were sunk outright, not including Jervis Bay, which herself had gone down with nearly 200 lives. San Demetrio had been abandoned to burn into the night, but the rest of the convoy had scattered and would survive. Cold comfort for the men in the boats, who had to spend a night being tossed around the ocean like a cork, next morning brought a full gale with huge waves. The open-top boats were battered and thrown around, filling with water, so the men had to bail nearly non-stop just to stay afloat. Our efforts now, recalled apprentice John Jones, were just survival, as the seas swamped the boats and often we bailed for our lives. As conditions grew worse, and they were seriously at risk of sinking with no help at hand, the boat loaded with 16 men was treated to an enticing sight. A call from someone announced a dark shape off to windward, a ship, somewhere off in the distance about 4 miles away. The men shouted, lit flares, and tried to wave her down, but there was no response. A brief period of depression followed, wrote Jones, which we soon realised was a luxury we could not afford, and the fight for our lives resumed. More flooding and endless bailing. It went on and on until the afternoon, when the storm seemed to calm, and then, again, another ship could be seen, but this one was tailed by an ominous, greasy cloud of smoke. The men hoisted a sail to catch the fresh breeze and try to run the ship down for rescue, but the closer they got, the more familiar the ship appeared. It took a while, Jones recalled, to recognise that this was our own ship. San Demetrio had not exploded. Instead, it had burnt through the night, and now continued to burn, but it was bearing down on the boat as if to swing past for a rescue. Faced now with the prospect of sinking at sea in their open-top boats, the men decided to try reboarding their own tanker to see what could be done. They bore down on it with sails set, but afternoon was slowly turning to evening, and with the failing light, a hard decision had to be made. Reboarding the ship in a big sea was tough enough, but to do it in the dark was insanity. The men settled in for another night in the cold in their open-top boat, but they brought their charge in behind the San Demetrio to shelter from the worst of the weather in the lee of her massive hull. After an agonising night, the dawn brought renewed hopes. Although San Demetrio drifted off about 5 miles, she still hadn't exploded. They rigged their sail once again and came up right alongside, aghast at the charred hull and twisted superstructure. Somewhere deep inside, the fire still raged and smoke was pouring into the sky. That anything would be better than staying in the boat being pummeled by the ocean. They swung themselves aboard and took stock of the situation. San Demetrio was a burnt mess. And worst of all, she was actually sinking. A shell had entered the port bow just above the waterline, explained Jones. It exploded and splinters had holed our collision bulkhead, resulting in our forehold making water, which was settling the vessel by the head. As if that wasn't bad enough, the main command and control centers of the ship had been reduced to a black, smoking mass of twisted steel. The bridge was long gone, along with all of the main crew accommodations amidships. Jones remembered that the main deck under the structure was buckled with heat from the fire, which had been so intense that the brass and glass of the portholes had melted and fused, resembling icicles. If the men had any chance of survival, though, they had to make do and save their ship. They broke out fire extinguishers and buckets and tried to douse the flames that were still licking at the after accommodations bulkheads. By some miracle, the chief engineer, Charles Pollard, had been aboard the lifeboat that had stumbled across the ship, so he ventured down below and found that the main machinery in the engine room was still largely workable, but the port boiler had been put out of action. With the metalwork still glowing red hot, Pollard and a handful of men had got the boiler repaired, and they raised enough pressure to bring the ship's dynamos and pumps back to life as well. With the water pressure on the lines, fire hoses could be brought to bear. 5 hours of battling flames and smoke later, this skeleton crew had doused the blaze, and the San Demetrio, although she was still technically sinking, albeit slowly, drifted into the night with their exhausted crew slumped over their hoses. 4 cabins had been undamaged by the fire, and the men passed out into a deep slumber, which was well earned, while a watch stayed up to make sure all was well. In the night, the fire at the stern started up again, but the handful of men who were actually on watch were able to put it out before daybreak, which brought its own surprises. In the night, the weather had got worse. Now, obviously, if the men had stayed in their boat, they couldn't have survived the night at all. As if to prove the point, the lifeboat, which they had lashed to the falls, had been ripped away and lost. Scrounging around below found that, although many of the supplies had been burnt up or contaminated, the ship's stores deep in the hold still contained potatoes, onions, and condensed milk. Yummy. Then there came a small cheer when 3 bottles of rum were found, which was good news, matched only by the announcement by Chief Engineer Pollard that the ship's engines still worked and they could get their battered, charred ship underway again. It seemed incredible, but there was a chance San Demetrio and this group of shipwrecked crewmen might actually make it to safety. They made a plan. The bridge and all of its equipment had been consumed by the fire, so there was no big compass to help guide them. But if they steered using the emergency compartment at the stern and the auxiliary gear, which a crew under Pollard had just got working again, for the sunset in the west that eventually hit the US or the Canadian coast. They did consider this briefly, but their ship was likely to sink if it was subjected to too much punishment at the bow, and a westward course would drive her into the worst of it. So instead, they chose to steer for the sunrise, or eastward, and pray that they hit the Irish or the English coast instead. We navigated, wrote Jones, by rare glimpses of the sun and stars, but mainly by keeping the wind astern. The 9th November to the 12th November, we proceeded approximately eastward in a very heavy weather, the vessel labouring and becoming very sluggish. San Demetrio was not in a good way, but they'd come so far the men tried everything they could to keep her afloat. Someone came up with the clever idea of draining the forward fuel tanks to lighten the ship's bow. It wasn't an easy job because the pump room was absolutely full of gas, but the chief, Jones, and a couple of others went down to open the valves and drain the tanks off, giving their ship a starboard list, but raising her bow so that she rode the waves easier. The bad weather threatened to sink their ship and gave every man on board serious cause for concern, but it also enveloped the vessel in a misty rain, and it made it difficult for prowling U-boats to spot the crippled vessel and finish her off. She was a sitting duck, but the bad weather was helping to keep her safe. Finally, on the 13th of November, land was sighted off in the distance, a wispy, dark streak that could just as easily have been occupied France as it was neutral Ireland. The men aboard had simply no idea. They made for a sheltered bay and stopped for the night to rest after their Herculean effort. Next morning came a shout as an aircraft roared overhead, which evidently reported their position because soon a tugboat and the British destroyer HMS Arrow arrived on the scene to assist. They were met with a shocking sight. The San Demetrio, charred and looking very much like a ghost ship, sat at anchor with SOS still chalked on her battered superstructure. The crew had done it, through blindly following the sun and stars that arrived off Ireland and been rescued by friendly forces. The maimed tanker got her engines running again and chugged along for the Clyde, escorted by Arrow and continuous air cover above. I doubt, said Jones, that any single merchant ship had, up to that time, enjoyed such a strong escorting force. San Demetrio, the unlikely survivor of Convoy HX84, anchored in the Clyde that night and was able to discharge her own fuel cargo using her own power and pumps, to Chief Engineer Pollard's great satisfaction. Remarkably, not only had San Demetrio survived the ordeal, she had successfully delivered her critical fuel supply, discharging 11,000 tons, only about 1,000 tons less than she'd set out with because it had burnt. Without books or instruments, charts or a compass, Jones and the others had safely navigated their ship some 1,500 kilometers or 944 miles over open ocean to safety. There was more good news yet. The other lifeboat, the one with 26 men in it, including Captain Waite, had gone off into the night, but was actually picked up and taken to safety in Newfoundland. The whole thing would have been a bloodless affair were it not for the wounding of greaser John Boyle in the evacuation. He'd been in Jones and Pollard's boat and held on best he could, but he died after 2 days. When San Demetrio was spotted off Ireland, her red dust flag was flying at half-mast out of respect for him. The men who'd brought San Demetrio in were pleased to learn that they were entitled to the salvage cut through maritime law, paid out to those able to rescue damaged or sinking ships. Pollard got £2,000 and Jones £1,200. That's about £96,000 and £58,000 in today's money respectively. So did the rest of the crew, and Boyle's family was paid his cut of £1,000 as well. Sadly, San Demetrio's fate had only been delayed. In March 1942, she was motoring off Virginia when she was sunk for good by a U-boat. The Battle of the Atlantic is legendary for its brutality. Those set adrift of the lifeboats often had no chance at survival or rescue, and many were never seen again. Were it not for the timely arrival of the burning San Demetrio, the 16 men in her lifeboat would probably have joined that number. Hundreds and hundreds of ships were sunk. Many friends of mine, wrote Jones in 1977, were lost with them. I consider myself very fortunate, he said, to have survived the war years and been able to continue with my sea career until 1971, whereas many friends hardly got the chance to begin theirs. The sacrifice of the merchant navy during the war is a powerful testament to the resilience of that unique creature known as the mariner, and the San Demetrio should forever be remembered as the ship that rescued her own crew.